Gives me great pleasure to introduce Steve Hayes.
That was a fantastic introduction. RJ, were you emailing with my mom before we came? Because that's just like what she always tells people at church. Thank you so much for having me here. It is sincerely an honor to be here with fellow conservatives tonight. I'm excited to be here. I was actually asked to keep my schedule open as a possible fill-in last time, and then you ended up getting somebody better. So I was thrilled to come to get the invite again this year. Made me feel better. It was good for my my ego. I want to start. Let me just start with the breaking news before we do anything else, because RJ set me up here. I'm sure a lot of you have learned this on your mobile devices, as RJ suggested. But the police in Boston have the suspect number 2, the younger of the 2 terrorists who bombed the Boston Marathon, surrounded right now. Oh, do they have him? See, this is what happened in the 45 seconds. So since we're crowdsourcing this, they took him alive, but he's injured. Good. So more on that in a bit. But let me start by thanking Wilman Henry, RJ, Frederick Anton, all of you for coming, all of you for having me here. As I say, this is just a real honor to be with you here tonight. It was terrific to listen to Senator DeMint earlier tonight, who is obviously a true hero to so many conservatives. And as president of the Heritage Foundation, it brought back great memories to hear him talk about heritage. My first job out of DePauw University was a job at the Heritage Foundation, where it was sort of an intellectual hothouse for me, and I spent time going to every single lecture I could go to and reading every single policy paper in my short time at Heritage, and I loved it. So I still have fond memories of Heritage. And I also identified with the governor, who had to run so that he could basically go home and collapse because he's exhausted. Because of this breaking news in Boston, I actually woke up at 3 a.m., I guess early this morning. I've been up ever since. I started reporting at about 3:15, trying to advance the story in whatever little ways I could. So, if my speech tonight is totally incoherent, that explains it. It's not just that I'm bad, although that's possible too. Let me start by anticipating and answering a few questions that I often get about Fox News. Actually, let me start before I have a Marco Rubio moment. Take a sip of water. We start by answering and anticipating a few questions I regularly get about the crew at Fox and on Special Report. So the answer to the first question is yes. Charles Krauthammer is, in fact, that brilliant. And Charles is also, it should be said, just a terrific guy. Down to earth, personable, easy to talk to, easy to get along with. And as I'm fond of telling people who ask me about him, if I were as brilliant as Charles Krauthammer, I would be insufferable. So it speaks very well of Charles that he's actually as down to earth as he is. And Bea Turner came up to me earlier tonight. I don't know if Bea is still here, but she came up to me earlier tonight and said, basically, Charles Krauthammer is my favorite Fox All-Star. And I had to say to Bea, I've never heard that before. That's not true. I hear that everywhere I go. And I don't take offense to it at all. Charles is terrific. The second answer, yes, we do, in fact, argue through the commercial breaks. The second we go to commercial, depending on who's on the panel that night, we'll start up and continue to argue. And at the end of the panel, after the kicker, that little funny thing we play at the end of the show, as often as not, we stand up, walk back to the makeup room, and we're arguing the whole way. We take up off our makeup, and we're still arguing. We go down to our cars, and we'll stand outside our cars and continue to argue. But it's all done in good fun, at least usually. And the third answer is no, I have never actually punched Juan Williams. We've been close a time or two, or those of you who saw the exchange that I had with Chuck Lane on Benghazi a couple weeks ago, people seem to really remember that. That was pretty frosty, that was a little close. But the truth is, the Special Report group is such a good group to be a part of. Not just Charles is down to earth, everybody's down to earth. Brett Baer, who's an old college buddy of mine, actually, we were fraternity brothers, has none of the TV ego that you get accustomed to when you work in that business. He's just as down to earth and real a guy as you can possibly hope to meet. So it's a treat to be a part of that show. And I'm happy to say, in fact, I don't think I've said this before, I'm going to be there for a while. We just signed up again, so I'm going to stick around at Fox for another few years. So I got my start in journalism in sort of a roundabout way. In 1996, I had an old girlfriend from DePauw University, gave me a call out of the blue. And she was working at the time as the executive assistant to Haley Barbour at the RNC. And she called and she said, Steve, do you have any interest in coming to work for Haley at the 1996 Republican Convention in San Diego? And at first I thought this was just a ruse. Maybe she wanted to get back together or, you know. And I was a little nervous. I was working at the time running the Institute on Political Journalism at Georgetown University, which is a terrific nonprofit. And I loved my job. I didn't really have any interest to get back involved in politics or try it firsthand. But I thought, you know, this may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see it up this close. I mean, to be working for Haley Barbour at the convention. Plus, it was in San Diego. So I decided to go. So I went there, and I showed up the first day, walked into the big hotel room, the suite where they were giving us our assignments, and the first thing I got was a shoebox. It was a shoebox full of convention credentials. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to a political convention before, but, you know, they hang these credentials around your neck, and they serve a couple different purposes. The first purpose is the obvious purpose. It's the purpose to tell you where you can and can't go. So if you have restricted access, you can't go down to the floor. If you have an officer of the convention badge, which is the best badge you can get, you can go anywhere. And the shoebox that I got was filled with officer of the convention badges. So they gave me this box, and they said, this is Haley Barbour's personal stash. Guard these with your life. I said, okay. They gave me an RNC-issued cell phone. They said, okay, be on your way. So I walked back to my room, and as I'm walking back to my room, I get a call on this brand new RNC-issued cell phone. And it's Millie Hallow, who is the executive assistant to Wayne LaPierre, head of the NRA. And she says, Steve, Mr. LaPierre isn't happy with his credentials, and he wants to know if he can have an upgrade. I thought for a minute, I had no idea if he could have an upgrade. Nobody told me what to do with these things. So I paused. Sure, he can have an upgrade. What does he want? So I gave him some nice passes. I told her I'd give him some nice passes and started to direct her to my hotel room. And before I can even get through giving the directions to my hotel room, there's a knock at the door. And there she is. So how did you know my cell phone number, which I'd just gotten, what room I was? Anyway, I gave her the convention credentials. She said, come to this great party that we're having later this week. You can bring as many friends as you want. And I thought, oh, this really is how politics works at this level. So I'd sort of met my purpose. My second job was even cooler. I was to serve as a host of Chairman Barbour's suites, you know, skyboxes and luxury suites, and they had a trailer underneath the stage for the convention speakers. And this was a pretty cool opportunity for a kid from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. So on Tuesday night, the best night of the convention in my view. This was former president's night, and I was in charge of hosting this fancy trailer, literally situated underneath the stage in San Diego. And it was not, you know, a trailer. This was nice. I mean, granite countertops, the whole deal, black leather sofas, big bar on the countertop. And that night, Tuesday night, was former president's night. So I was going to get to meet former presidents. And for a kid from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, I'd never met the president of a Kiwanis club, much less the president of the United States. So I'm ecstatic. But I'm also scared. So I'm kind of freaking out and running around, basically being a dork. And then there's a knock on the door. And I go and answer the door, and there standing before me is Gerald Ford and the former First Lady. Whoa, this is the big time. Please come in, Mr. President. Have a seat. Seated them on this fancy leather couch. And then I did exactly what I was told to do. I walked over to the granite countertop. I went to the makeshift bar. I got a big bottle of Maker's Mark bourbon, which is Haley Barbour's favorite drink, 2 big old tumblers. Walked over and offered a drink to Betty Ford. Most famous alcoholic in human history. Not my best moment. She was as gracious as you might imagine she would be, but I decided then and there I have no future in politics. I'm really bad at this. I'm going to try to get into a profession where you can insult people and earn a living that way. So I got into journalism. But my start in journalism, at least in television journalism, didn't go very well either. My first big break, this was a big break, came when I got a call on a Friday morning about 10 o'clock in the morning from the top producer at the McLaughlin Group. Now this was a thrill. I was newly in Washington, D.C. again after going to grad school. I'd just returned. Fred Barnes, one of my mentors, had done the McLaughlin Group for years. I was just so thrilled to be asked to be on the show. I get this call at 10 a.m. and I say, sure, absolutely, I can be there. She says, great, we're taping at 1. I hang up the phone. And as soon as I hang up the phone, I think, I probably wasn't their first choice. And the reason I knew that was because her first question to me was, are you wearing a suit? And the second question was, the taping was 3 hours later. So I didn't have time to prepare. They basically needed a warm body, and I was going to be the warm body. The other mistake I made was not asking for the topics. You need the topics. So I called her back, and I said, look, you didn't mention the topics, and I know I said I'd do it, but I really ought to know the topics before I do it. She said, that's fine. We're going to talk about taxes, we're going to talk about Iraq, and we're going to talk about cloning, and we're going to talk about this. I thought, okay, I'm okay on taxes. I'm decent on Iraq. I know that pretty well. Cloning? Haven't spent a lot of time on cloning, but I'll fight through that and then find refuge afterwards. So I show up for the taping in my suit, and it's just, it's just how you'd imagine. It's this big satin there across is Eleanor Clift, and in my head I keep hearing that Saturday Night Live skit. Did you ever see that of the McLaughlin Group? Eleanor, you smell-anor. And every time I looked over, that's what I thought. Eleanor, you smell-anor. And Pat Buchanan was one of the other panelists, and I think Mort Zuckerman was the third. So we start the show, and I'm nervous as heck. This is my first time doing TV, and we get through taxes, and we get through Iraq, and I'm doing fine. And then comes the third topic. And those of you who have watched the show know how Father McLaughlin introduces new topics. He said, and this will be terrible, I'm going to warn you, this is a terrible imitation, but I'm going to do it anyway. He said, issue 3. And he turns and looks right at me. Says, what does the organ transplant lobby think of Senator Mary Landrieu? I ask you, Stephen Hayes. What? I have no idea. I didn't even know there was an organ transplant lobby. No idea what they think of Senator Mary Landrieu. So, you know, I have this momentary panic. What in the world do you say in response to that question? So I look across, hoping that, you know, Eleanor might throw me a line, and in my head it's, Eleanor, you smell-anor. But I'm looking at her like, come on. No. Sort of leans back in her chair, and Buchanan's a little nicer. He at least gives me sort of a charitable smile, like, you're on your own, kid. Thanks for coming. So I start my answer. I had to say something. So I start my answer, and I said, well, I can tell you that this is going to be a very, very heated debate. This is an important issue, and people on both sides have very, very strong feelings. Take the organ transplant lobby. Senator Mary Landrieu, she has strong feelings. And this is going to unfold on Capitol Hill over the next few weeks. And I sort of sat back, very pleased with myself. How about that? It may well go down in the history of Washington commentary as the most vapid thing ever said, which is really, really saying something. But it was a good experience. I learned a couple things. One, I've never been asked to be back on the McLaughlin Group. It's a true story, never been asked once. And two, I've learned if you don't know something, just say you don't know something. So I try to practice that on Special Report. You can't, you really can't say I don't know all the time, because then people stop listening to you. But when I don't know something, I try to say, I just don't know. And it seems to work for me, at least in that context. So what I'm going to do tonight is different than I had planned on doing for the past 2 weeks. I've been working on a speech, had it sort of laid out, structure, all of the things were set up in place. And then Boston happened. And I hadn't been planning to spend much time on national security. And then the events of the last 18 hours happened. And I thought, I really need to talk about this. This is important. And in fact, one of my criticisms of Republicans in Washington these days is that they're not spending enough time talking about these issues. And I think we ought to talk about them. So I'm going to talk about what's happened in Boston. I'm going to talk broadly about counterterrorism strategy and how the president has handled these issues. And then I'm going to give you sort of a truncated version of the speech that I had prepared over the past couple weeks. I hope it works, but as I say, I've been up forever, so it could be a disaster. I appreciate your indulgence and your patience. Let me start by saying everyone stands with President Obama on our desire to apprehend these terrorists and others like them and their accomplices. Everyone. And I want to make clear, before I say anything else, that no one is responsible for terrorism other than the terrorists who conduct the terrorist attacks. Now, I wish that some on the left had given President Bush that same courtesy, but I think it's important to say it and to be forthright about it. They're responsible. At the same time, how the U.S. government approaches terrorism matters. And even in these early hours of this attack in Boston and its aftermath, I see signs, troubling signs from my perspective, that we may be repeating some of the same mistakes that we saw play out over the first term. Newsweek magazine this afternoon, in a terrific, well-reported, well-researched article about sort of the history of these terrorists and terrorists coming out of Chechnya, Islamic terrorists coming out of Chechnya, reported this, and this is a direct quote. This is about 1:30 this afternoon this was reported. One U.S. intelligence official who regularly briefs on the investigation told Newsweek that he and his colleagues had all but ruled out Al-Qaeda Central or any of its affiliates giving direct or specific instructions for the attack. I read that sentence and I stopped. We have known the identities of these attackers at that point for what, 12 hours? And this official and his colleagues had ruled out the possibility that Al-Qaeda might have played a role? How is that even possible? Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older, more radical, more experienced of the two attackers in Boston, have traveled outside the country for 6 months just last year. The U.S. government knows that he flew into and out of Russia, and for most of the day today, we didn't know where he was. And then on the drive over tonight, I heard an NBC analyst, former head of the National Counterterrorism Center, report that Tamerlan Tsarnaev had been in Chechnya, had returned to Chechnya, a hotbed in some respects of jihadist terrorism. We don't know what he did there. We don't have any idea. But we do know that there are al-Qaeda affiliates that operate in and around Chechnya. We know that Tamerlan Tsarnaev had social media postings glorifying jihad, expressing views sympathetic to those of al-Qaeda. We know that the IJU operates in Chechnya. It's responsible for radicalizing many Chechen youngsters. Now, does this mean that the older of the two attackers, the lead attackers, somehow swore bayat or loyalty to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the new leader, the now head of al-Qaeda? Or does it mean that he was a member of al-Qaeda or even met with an affiliate? Of course it doesn't mean that. But it would be irresponsible in the extreme to rule out those possibilities. 12 hours, 24 hours after we learned the identities of these brothers. And here was something that broke just before I came up on stage. Fox reported that the FBI had actually interviewed Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older of the two brothers. The FBI interviewed him in 2011 because a foreign government had asked us to explore his ties to extremists. We interviewed him. He became a citizen the next year. Part of the problem is that we've seen this before. Complacence, we might call it. And you all know what I'm talking about. Benghazi, of course, was first labeled a spontaneous attack, triggered by an anti-Islam film that very few people around the world had actually seen. This claim lived for weeks, despite abundant evidence to the contrary. You had, just to cite a couple of examples, real-time conversations between the people on the ground in Benghazi and folks back at the State Department reporting the blow-by-blow of what was happening. We learned that under oath in congressional testimony. You had on September 12th, the day after the attacks, a memo from the CIA station chief in Libya detailing the attacks and the attackers, listing the al-Qaeda affiliates who were involved in the Benghazi attacks. We had intercepts that were publicly reported within days in which members of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb spoke of their participation in those attacks. We knew all of this within the first 2 or 3 days, and yet Susan Rice, as everybody knows, went on 5 Sunday shows and told the country basically, we don't know if this was a terrorist attack. You had the President of the United States weeks later in a speech at the United Nations once again blame the film. We don't know if it's a terrorist attack. He was asked directly in a television talk show, was this a terrorist attack? He wouldn't answer the question directly, weeks later, despite the evidence. Before that, back in May of 2010, you had the New York Times Square bombing and Faisal Shahzad. Janet Napolitano, the day after that attempted bombing, called the Times Square attack a one-off, and administration officials downplayed connections to international terror. The problem was the Pakistani Taliban had already taken credit. And Eric Holder acknowledged a week later that the Pakistani Taliban had indeed planned and financed the attempted bombing. You had, in December of 2009, Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the Christmas Day bomber. 3 days after the attempted bombing on Christmas Day, and long after the terrorist had acknowledged his ties to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, in interviews with those who apprehended him. The President of the United States, in a public speech, called him, quote, an isolated extremist, unquote. Now, this time around, the President didn't say terrorism in his first statement. But that statement came just 3 hours after the attacks, and I have a hard time, even though I think it was clear to everybody, if you look at what had happened, that this was almost certainly a terrorist attack. I have a hard time getting excited or upset with the president just 3 hours after an attack for failing to call it that way. I think there's something to be said for some presidential caution. I think that's fine. Might even be prudent. But that caution is okay only if it's not a reflection of complacence. And with this administration having declared several times that jihadist threats are diminished, particularly here on our homeland, it might well be complacence. The President of the United States, in speeches over the past year, has declared, quote, "The tide of war is receding." And he said that our wars overseas will end, quote, "on schedule." War doesn't work like that. We're the United States. We don't aim to end our wars. We aim to win our wars. So what about President Obama, more broadly? Let's go back to the beginning. When the country first met President Obama, he presented himself to us as a centrist and as a pragmatist. In 2004, he gave a beautiful speech. I was standing right below him. A beautiful speech at the Democratic National Convention. Red America, blue America. We aren't red America, we aren't blue America. We're the United States of America. And throughout much of the 2008 campaign, he portrayed himself as a non-ideological problem solver who would bring an end to the ideological years of the Bush administration. The press corps, needless to say, bought it entirely, repeated it, amplified it. Obama the pragmatist, they declared. Most conservatives, I imagine most people in this room, never bought it. We paid attention to the things that he said. So when he told Joe the plumber that he wanted to spread the wealth around, that mattered to us. We heard what that meant. And when he said in a debate to Charlie Gibson, who asked him, would you still want to raise capital gains taxes if it wasn't going to result in more money coming to the federal government? The president said yes. That's not a practical problem solver. That's an ideologue. And we saw that. He's elected, and his first act as president is the stimulus, which he outsources promptly to Nancy Pelosi and Democrats in Congress. They funded a wide variety of things, nearly $1 trillion. Some of it spent on things like a study to determine whether you were more intoxicated after smoking pot and drinking malt liquor than you would have been if you just did one or the other. They used regression analyses to make the determination that, in fact, yeah, that'll really mess you up. I'm not kidding. It's just totally true. It's checkable. Dr. R. Lorraine Collins, SUNY Buffalo. Check it, $400,000. And more recently, we heard, thanks to my colleague at the Weekly Standard, Daniel Halper, about the $400,000 grant to Indiana University for condom practice. Teach people how to put on a condom. Your tax dollars at work. Then, after the stimulus, after $1 trillion in stimulus money, we had health care, we had cost controls, we had IPAB, we had a top-down takeover of 1/6 of the U.S. economy, regardless of what the president wants to call it. And yet after that, even after that, the mainstream media called the president a pragmatist. He was a problem solver. He was non-ideological. Articles by Fareed Zakaria, others who sort of drive the narrative in Washington. This president is a pragmatist. He gets things done. And then we had 2010, about which I'll say more a little bit later. The president didn't adjust. This was no Bill Clinton. Remember, after the 1994 elections, Bill Clinton moved to the center. Triangulation was the Dick Morris phrase. He even gave a State of the Union sometime later, the 1996 State of the Union, in which he declared the era of big government is over. President Obama didn't do that. His next State of the Union in 2011 was a defense of activist government and a call for more spending. And in the 2012 elections, he ran even further to the left. His campaign team had decided early that it was going to be a base election, and that's how they ran it. Class warfare. Get people to the polls. The 2012 election had Mitt Romney against Barack Obama. One of the most important jobs of conservatives today, of conservatives always, is to provide an alternative vision to the one we see from President Obama and his allies. The country didn't really get that in 2012. Mitt Romney was never a conservative. He was not a visceral conservative. He was a campaign conservative, a consultant conservative. He went to CPAC and, of course, as we all know, repeated the word conservative more than 24 times. He called himself severely conservative, a descriptor you usually use to describe things like headaches and bad weather. Romney was afraid to run on health care, the president's signature domestic policy achievement, despite its strong and continued unpopularity. The Romney campaign as often as not made statements, not arguments, and it's an important distinction. They made statements, not arguments. They decided early that they were going to run on the economy. The economy was bad. Presidents don't get reelected in a bad economy. We're going to tell people the economy's bad. And so they did. The economy's bad. The economy's bad. The economy's bad. But the polls really didn't change. The economy's bad. The economy's bad. What's the matter with you people? The economy's bad. And the polls didn't change. Stuart Stevens, who was the chief strategist of the Romney campaign, explained his strategy in an interview with Politico in mid-September. And he said, this is a very close paraphrase, if not a direct quote, "Politics is like sports. There is no right or wrong. You pick a strategy and stick to it." I'm serious. He said that. I'm serious. An incredible, incredible comment. Mitt Romney didn't run as a conservative. After the CPAC speech in the primaries, his campaign didn't really use conservative that much, and it certainly didn't call Barack Obama a liberal. This in a country where conservatives self-identify 2-to-1 over self-identified liberals. At the Republican National Convention, only one primetime speaker used the word liberal to describe the president. Only one, and it wasn't Mitt Romney. I think as important, Romney took very important conservative arguments and got them wrong. He came close. He got close to making very good arguments, but he got them wrong in two very important respects. The first, as we know, was his comments about the very poor. Now, Romney's comments were meant to say, we have a safety net. We can help people rise up from their stations in life. But in fact, his words said almost exactly the opposite. And then on the surreptitiously taped fundraising speech that he gave, you had the 47%. Now again, this is very, very close to not only a worthwhile conservative argument, but an essential conservative argument. It's definitely the case that too many Americans are becoming dependent on government. It's morally corrosive. It's fiscally unsustainable. It's a good argument, and made the right way, it's an argument that wins majority support, but Romney didn't make it the right way. He concluded his comments by saying, "My job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them that they should take personal responsibility and care for themselves." That's the opposite of why I became a conservative. I became a conservative precisely because free markets and freedom generally raises people from their stations in life. Nobody is assigned to a station in life in America. And Romney's comments, in effect, said the opposite, even if it's not what he intended to say. In the exit polls, the most interesting number in those exit polls came when pollsters asked voters, who cares most about voters like me? And some of you may have heard these numbers. 81% said Barack Obama. 18% said Mitt Romney. And I would argue that it's basically because he told them he wasn't going to care. Then we get to the second term. We get to Barack Obama's second term. The second inaugural is a passionate defense of activist government. The State of the Union, he lays out in great detail what he's going to do to expand the size and scope of government in the United States. The day after the State of the Union, the New York Times wrote in an analysis that President Obama, in giving that speech, had announced, quote, an end to the politics of austerity. At which point I thought, when did that start? So what should conservatives do? Well, I argue 2 cheers for gridlock. The old cliche has it, the best offense is a good defense. I think that's wrong. The best offense is a good offense. But a good defense is important too. Now you have hand-wringers in Washington complaining that the government is lurching from crisis to crisis, and in so doing is sort of crowding out these more important issues. I remember listening to an NPR show. Yes, I do listen to NPR. And a comment from David Wessel, who's a very well-respected reporter on budget and finance issues for the Wall Street Journal. Very good reporter. And he made a comment to the effect that he was disappointed that we had to continue to talk about things like budgets and sequester, fiscal cliffs, because we weren't spending our time talking about universal pre-K. My reaction is, these are exactly the things we should be spending our time talking about. We want to be talking about the size and scope of government because very little matters more than that right now when you're approaching $17 trillion in debt, $4 billion a day, $48,000 a second. So what should conservatives do? As Jim DeMint said earlier, I think the answer in many respects is to go back to 2010, to go back to the things that made conservatives so successful in that historic election. And I want to tell you this in a way that's probably a little unconventional. I want to tell you this by sharing some stories about my son, Connor, who's 6 years old. I have 3 kids. Grace is my 8-year-old, Connor's my 6-year-old, and Jane is the baby. She's 3. And when Jane was born, I took Connor and Grace to the hospital. And their mother had come up with what I thought was a foolish idea, a gimmick, and she thought was a brilliant idea. We tested the proposition. She handed Grace and Connor capes and said to Grace, "You're super sister," said to Connor, "You're super brother," to get them to buy into this whole having another kid thing. And it worked. I was wrong. Don't tell her I said that. I was wrong. The kids were flying around the hospital, super brother and super sister. I took them down to the cafeteria, sat down, and cafeteria-style seating. You sit with anybody who sits with you. And soon we were joined by a big gaggle of nurses. Wonderful, talkative, friendly, warm people. And they struck up a conversation, and one of the nurses, sort of the lead nurse, a little large, started a conversation with my son, Connor, and was asking him, "What's with the cape?" And he said, "Oh, I'm a super brother. My mom just had a little baby. Isn't this great?" And she said, "Oh, that's so wonderful. You're going to be a wonderful brother." And as she was talking to him, I could see his eyes travel from contact with her eyes down to her stomach. And I knew what was coming. And she was beyond childbearing years. There's very little doubt about that. And you stop as a dad and you think, do I reach over and cup his mouth? So I just waited. And then there it was. "When's your baby?" So I scrambled. Your mind is racing. What can I do to make this better? And I looked at her and I said, "Don't worry about it." He says that to everybody. He would have said that if you looked like a supermodel. And then I thought, oh, the worst possible thing to say. So I promptly gathered up the kid. "Let's go, kids. Let's get out of here." Not long after that, I took Connor to get an x-ray. We were in a waiting room, and I was talking to a gentleman who's a regular Fox News viewer, a wonderful guy. His wife walks out from behind. She just had an x-ray herself. She's wearing an eye patch. You can imagine. Connor saw the eye patch, stared at her, never stopped looking at the eye patch, and when she sat down said, "Are you a pirate?" But here's the thing, Connor doesn't usually get things wrong. Like both of those times he was off a little bit. Usually what he does is he captures exactly what it is that I'm thinking or adults are thinking, and he captures sort of an essential truth. So we were at the butcher shop that I go to. The guy next to me, huge guy, orders 7 pounds of sausage. They hand it over the counter. Connor looks at the sausage, looks at the guy, looks at the sausage, looks at the guy, says, "Whoa! That's a lot of sausage. You have a fat tummy." We went to the bagel shop, and this nice, wonderful girl who was helping get our bagels had a pierced bottom lip. Connor looked right at her and said, "What's that in your lip? It looks really weird." Well, all this came to a head. This is what Connor does. He makes these observations, captures these simple truths. Well, all this came to a head one day when my wife was driving Connor to his lacrosse practice. Now, the closest gas station to our house, as RJ said, we live out in the boonies, is a full serve, or it was before we moved, was a full serve. And she had no gas, so she stops at the full serve, and the guy who comes to fill the tank has zero hair, zero, shiny, shaves it all off, shiny. And Connor looks right at him and says, "Whoa, you are bald." And my wife had had it. This was enough. She's, "Connor James Hayes, you need to watch your mouth. We don't talk to people like that. You need to zip it. You know, just let him have it." And Connor's, you gotta understand, he's a gentle kid. You know, he plays hockey for the Naval Academy, and he doesn't like to steal the puck from the other kids because he thinks it's too mean. That's how sensitive and gentle he is. And so she's reading him the riot act, and he gets these big tears in his eyes, and he starts pouting out his lip, and he's very sad. She says, "Connor, when he comes back, I need you to apologize." "Okay, Mom." So the guy comes back, gives my wife her credit card, and Connor looks right at me and says, "I'm really sorry, bald sir." Connor knew exactly what he was doing. We thought he was naive and innocent, but what he was doing was expressing simple truths. And you ask, what does this have to do with the 2010 election? That's what happened in the 2010 election. The Tea Party, conservatives, made simple observations about the way things are happening in Wisconsin. And the media thought they knew better. Oh, these Tea Party people, they're so simple. They don't get it. And in fact, we did get it. We got it more than they got it. So we asked simple questions. So we asked the simple questions. Shouldn't members of Congress read the bills before they vote on them? And I'm not kidding. You can ask John Gizzi, ask John Fund. When you say that in Washington, people look at you like you're crazy. We could never possibly do that. That's why we have staff. No, you ought to read the bills before you vote on them. We ask questions like, shouldn't we spend as a country only what we take in? Pretty simple. Shouldn't we debate the debt ceiling before we consider raising it? Some 50 times the debt ceiling had been raised basically in a perfunctory manner. Shouldn't we at the very least have a debate about the debt ceiling? And finally, of course, shouldn't we look to the Constitution to tell us what it is the government should and shouldn't be doing? This is what happened. This is what happened in 2010. The American people were then and are now worried about our country. We're worried about the survival of the American dream. We're worried that people who work hard and play by the rules, as the old cliche has it, are no longer rewarded for doing that. And we're worried, maybe above anything else, that our children, that my Connor, isn't going to have the opportunities that I had. Jim DeMint spoke earlier about the simple principles of freedom. It's a simple way of putting it, but that's exactly the right way to talk. Conservatives need to speak to these people who are worried about the future, who are worried about their country. But more importantly, conservatives need to speak for these people who are worried about their country. This is common sense conservatism. It's conviction conservatism, and it's what we need now more than ever. Thank you very much for having me.